After beating Metroid for the first time a few weeks ago, large in part to a guide, it had me wondering what exactly Metroid II Return of Samus would be like. In my opinion, NES Troid had great presentation and solid design ideas, brought down with antiquated crypticness and a rather unforgiving health system, which, in all honesty, made me very concerned for the sequel. Considering you were somewhat downgrading the power of the hardware to the Game Boy, in the back of my mind it was going to be a stripped down and equally as confusing entry in the franchise. But, in reality, I was pleasantly surprised by Return of Samus. By no means is it a great game, as you'll see, my prediction was half right, but the cautious pessimism I had was met with a more refined experience than I anticipated. Right off the bat, the first impressions are very similar to the predecessor. Samus is just kinda there, then you're off. Nothing is really prompted for the player, you just get the idea of what you're doing, although you're on the outskirts of World SR388 here, whilst you were beamed into Brinstar before. However, a key difference in the sequel is shown in the heads-up display: health, missiles, and Metroids. See, while the original had two mini-bosses and Mother Brain as the mandatory major enemies, with Metroids as a late-stage minor enemy, in Return of Samus, they're the centerpiece. During the first area of the game, you dwell deeper into the cave, coming to a point where the path splits into two. The right side is blocked off with acid, so your only option is to go leftwards instead. And there you meet the first Metroid. In all honesty, this one segment makes the Metroid in Return of Samus far more intimidating than literally any enemy from the first game. Barring the Rinkers, of course, they were fucked up. The transformation, the music, the enemy sound effects. It's a really well done introduction on a Game Boy no less. But after 5 missile hits, the Metroid is defeated, with 38 more to go. This battle is followed by an earthquake, so now the acid from earlier has sunk further into the cave and you can now access areas you couldn't before. And that's the cycle for Metroid II. Explore, take out Metroid, progress further, and so on. So stylistically, there's a similar sense of progression in both games. Albeit in Metroid 1, the only time an area changes due to enemies is when you're able to access Torian after defeating Kraid and Ridley. Your progress is usually just stifled when you don't have the sufficient items yet. Return of Samus creates a greater blend of enemy and item-based progression, which works out far better personally. A drawback to the original is that you can be at the mercy of Brinstar or Norfair's mystery in navigating, whilst here there's a clear indicator as to how far you can go, along with knowing exactly when you can go again. The earthquake animation only appears after you take out all the Metroid within an area. There's also parts which are inaccessible unless you have the appropriate item, typically sequestered somewhere you're now exploring. As some Metroid are only accessible through having this item, it guarantees you found what you needed before the next part of the game opens up. Though in an abstract sense it makes the game more linear, I'd argue that's for the superior player experience. More changes in the game are directly with Samus too. For one, controlling her feels significantly heavier in the sequel. Considering Samus is sort of lumbering in a giant metal suit, it makes sense, but as a bonus I think the controls in Metroid 2 are much tighter than the predecessor. Sometimes in NES Troid I'd completely miss what are really easy jumps, whereas though I had a tendency to undershoot, the sequel felt more precise. That said, one thing about Samus in the sequel that's genuinely amazing is this. Yeah, you can crouch now, as well as shoot directly down, and this is a godsend considering you could only shoot while standing and directly upwards before. Enemies on the floor can be shot at rather than needing to be bombed. It's just a big old quality of life improvement. Which, speaking of quality of life improvements, you can save in Metroid 2 at full health. Rather than starting on 30 HP to build up from, you just have whatever you saved on. This alone makes the game an improvement outright in my opinion. When I assumed that Metroid 2 would be a stripped back and confusing sequel, I was thankfully very wrong about it being stripped back. It feels much more robust than the original. Unfortunately, there was one glaring issue that I have with Metroid 2, and you already know. Where the fuck do I even go? I knew that Return of Samus would likely continue with the same cryptic elements, but my lord, I highly recommend if you play this game to use a guide online. This isn't beating Metroid 2 how Nintendo intended either, it's beating Metroid 2 thanks to Radix37 on GameFAQs, which is an admittedly way better title. If I didn't have it, I genuinely don't know how far I would have been able to make it. I played the game for about an hour the first time. In that time I took out 4 Metroid until I kept backtracking, looking to see if I'd missed anything, wondering what I was doing wrong, then caving in to look at the map. Embarrassingly, it was literally just jumping on here and rolling through. So this is where I think the real divide of me analysing older games comes in, as perhaps this is just a given to some. Which, sure. NES Troid had plenty of things that hinted at the need to bomb walls and get into different places. I just couldn't put it together and figure it out. And after getting through this game with the guide, I stand by that fact. This might be to do with the hardware, as the palette is somewhat limiting. In a lot of the areas throughout Metroid II, there were vertical areas, corridors, or just all sorts that blended in with one another. Sometimes there'd be obvious hints at blocks that could be broken, other times it's just blind guesswork unless you know. And for the record, I think this game has the ability to look excellent. It's hampered by the aforementioned palette, but I think the sprite work in this game is very commendable in getting across the sense of atmosphere and style in spite of the limitations. This is also in combination with the soundtrack. Though I don't find it as memorable as the first game, it still retains that great atmosphere in the series. But everything sort of merges together in my mind, trying to really remember what is what. In fairness, that largely comes from me using a guide too, except I was getting lost using the guide. I was just massively perplexed. And that's a negative portion of the video, thank you for listening. Despite that particular grievance, I think the newer improvements of Return of Samus outweigh the familiar drawbacks. For example, the items which you get have expanded quite a bit. Outside of the Wave Beam and Ice Beam, there's now the Spazer and Plasma Beam as alternate shots. There's a Spider Ball option that allows Samus to stick to surfaces vertically and horizontally. Then eventually you get the Space Jump option that allows the player to infinitely jump places. As the area you're in is much more open-ended in some respects, this creates a really great effect of making you feel insignificant at first, until you later have all the items you need to conquer the area easily. It feels very Metroidvania-esque, in the sense that you start off competent yet lacking in ability, until gradually you're able to become an ultra-powerful space hunter that can jump 20 times the height they could at the beginning. Then there's also the case of enemies. In reality, the non-Metroids are so unnoteworthy. They're really just a minor inconvenience for the most part, so instead I'm going to focus on the different kind of Metroid mutations you face. There are 5 stages of evolutions on the original Metroid. You also face the classic type in the final part. The Alpha, Gamma, Zeta, Omega, and Queen Metroid. Firstly, their transformation animations are really cool. Also, really terrifying. I'm glad the palette is only black and white, otherwise you'd see considerably more brown. But there isn't too much strategy with any of them. Depending on their stage of mutation, they just take more missiles to kill, getting gradually more specific where you have to shoot them as the stages mutate. The coin is flipped when it comes to the final boss, however. Queen Metroid is a difficult yet fair final boss, and feels drastically more fun to fight than Mother Brain ever did. She has 3 attacks, a fireball attack, a closed mouth lunge with her neck, and an open mouth lunge. But you're able to dodge effectively with the screw attack, as well as stun the Queen with a well-timed missile attack, which leaves her open to more missiles. 150 missiles take out the Queen, and a secret thing where you roll into a ball and plant bombs in her, but I didn't know that until after I did this, so shh. And while it was frustrating, it never fully felt unfair. One minor inconvenience is that the invincibility frames on Samus combined with the pushback can stack a bunch of damage, but beyond that, it never felt cheap, and the win, when it did happen, felt glorious. Then, after the Queen disintegrates, you come across a baby Metroid that sticks around you to help you through the last part of the game. Except, while the ending of the original just felt triumphant, here it felt strange. Like, I thought Metroid were motherfuckers from the first game, and here they're the prime antagonists. But when you've got a cute little alien friend squeaking along, helping you escape, it kind of makes me feel sad. It's weird, it's almost a sense of melancholy if I can describe it that way. But considering what the first game wasn't able to make me feel, I do find the ending of Metroid II far better personally. And that's how I really feel about Metroid 2. As a sequel to Metroid on NES, it is a much better version. As a game, it still has its problems. The crypticness of it necessitated a guide for me to use, and some issues are simply to do with the hardware, like the palette doing no favours for the graphics or the enemies being lackluster bar the Metroids. Still, there's a lot to appreciate and enjoy in Return of Samus. The quality of life improvements are a godsend, the general game design bar the Crypticness is much more refined and enjoyable, and I think I would have loved this game had I been in the generation to grow up playing it. But how I describe both Metroid 1 and 2 are entries that can be made great. If they were made a few more years down the line, refine them a bit, then maybe they could have been that much better. Oh wait. Hello, it's me, the video man at the end of the video. I just wanted to say thank you to watching if you got this far, and just thank you to everyone generally for how well the channel's been doing pretty recently. Like, for 2 days, the Metroid video I did before this blew up, and I've got just unprecedented support I've not seen on this channel before or since, and I'm just incredibly thankful for it. Hoping to hit 100 subscribers by the end of the month now, which is my goal at the end of the year. It's out of nowhere. It boggles my mind, but I'm so thankful for it. Yeah, just thank you for watching. Take care. Stay safe.